A Nissan Patrol with under 100,000 kilometres just cracked its cylinder head, and the repair bill is bigger than the truck is worth. You'd assume that's a one-off. But a Toyota Hilux is doing the exact same thing. On an engine, Toyota's own service bulletin admits cracks its pistons. The badge on the bonnet tells you almost nothing about whether that engine survives to 150,000 kilometres. These are 7 Aussie 4-wheel drive engines quietly dying before their time, and 3 that simply refuse to die. Let's set the scene properly before we get into it. 150,000 kilometres isn't an extreme ask for a modern diesel. It isn't even halfway to what a well-built engine should manage, and every single engine on this list was sold with the promise that it would tow a boat, handle a corrugated outback track, and still be worth decent money as a trade in years down the line. First, 7 engines quietly wrecking Aussie tourers and tradies well before their time, counting down to the worst offender. Number 7, the Jeep Grand Cherokee Eco Diesel, and an oil cooler that quietly poisons the engine from the inside. From 2014 through 2019, Jeep fitted the Grand Cherokee with a 3-litre V6 diesel built by the Italian manufacturer VM Motori, badged Eco Diesel. On paper, it's a genuinely clever engine, strong torque, decent fuel economy, smooth enough to be a comfortable family tow rig. The weak point sits in a small, easy-to-ignore component called the oil cooler, which lives inside the oil filter housing and uses engine coolant to keep oil temperature under control. When that cooler fails internally, oil and coolant begin mixing, and owners describe pulling the dipstick to find something that looks closer to a milkshake than clean diesel oil. Here is why that's catastrophic, rather than just annoying. Contaminated oil stops protecting the crankshaft bearings the way it's meant to. Keep driving on it, even just for the short trip to a mechanic, and the big end bearings can spin and effectively weld themselves to the connecting rod. At that point, you aren't looking at an oil cooler replacement anymore. You're looking at a new engine, because the crankshaft and rods underneath are already scored beyond repair. A Sydney-based workshop called GDL Automotive, which specialises in these engines, ran its own investigation, pulling data from roughly 50 documented failure cases spread across Australia, the United States, and Canada. Their conclusion was blunt. The failures showed up regardless of oil change frequency, regardless of full service history, and regardless of whether the vehicle had ever been driven hot. In other words, you could do absolutely everything by the book, keep every receipt, and still lose the engine to a part most owners have never even heard of. If your Grand Cherokee's coolant reservoir ever looks even slightly oily, that isn't a top-up and forget situation. Get it checked immediately, because every kilometre you keep driving on contaminated oil is a kilometre closer to a bottom end that can't be saved. It's worth remembering the Grand Cherokee was never a niche import in this country either. Jeep sold plenty of them as genuine family tow rigs across Australian suburbs, and a fair number of those owners had absolutely no idea a failed $40 cooler could turn into a rebuild bill that rivals what they paid for a small hatchback. Number 6, the Mitsubishi Triton and Pajero Sport, and a cylinder head that seems to have been designed against its own injectors. Since 2015, the MQ and MR generation Triton, alongside its Pajero Sport twin, has run a 2.4 litre 4-cylinder diesel known as the 4in15. It's a modern, common rail engine, and for the most part it does exactly what it's supposed to. The problem is one very specific, very well documented weak point. The wall of aluminium surrounding each fuel injector port in the cylinder head is unusually thin, and it's prone to cracking, particularly any time an injector has to come out for servicing. One Triton owner on Whirlpool, one of Australia's biggest general discussion forums, bought a used 2016 model showing 178,000 kilometres and soon discovered a small coolant leak. The dealership diagnosed a cracked cylinder head right at the injector port and told him flatly that the head couldn't be repaired and that no replacement heads were available at all. A diesel engine still well inside its expected working life and effectively unrepairable over what started as nothing more than a coolant leak. It gets more interesting from there. In 2016, Mitsubishi quietly reduced the factory engine warranty on these vehicles from 130,000 kilometres down to 100,000 kilometres. Owners on forums have connected the dots themselves, and while Mitsubishi has never publicly confirmed the reason for the change, the timing lines up a little too neatly with when this exact cracking issue started turning up in workshops around the country. The mechanism itself is almost embarrassingly simple. Pull an injector that's stuck from carbon buildup. Apply the kind of removal force that's completely routine for that job, and you can start a hairline crack in a wall of metal that was never given much margin to begin with. From there, it's only a matter of time before that crack reaches the coolant gallery, and once it does, the head is finished. What makes this one sting a bit more is just how many Tritons are actually out there. This is consistently one of the best-selling utes in the country, which means a genuinely enormous number of these engines are quietly approaching that scheduled 60,000 kilometre valve clearance service some owners believe is the exact moment the cracking risk starts climbing. Number 5. The Land Rover Discovery Sport and Range Rover Evoque, running Jaguar Land Rover's Ingenium 2-litre diesel and a timing chain that was marketed, almost unbelievably, as maintenance-free. That exact phrase matters, because it's the wording several owners point straight back to when their timing chain let go decades ahead of any reasonable schedule. One Melbourne-based owner reported his chain failing at 95,000 kilometres, out of nowhere, with no prior warning noise. Another owner's 2016 Discovery needed its timing chain replaced at around 110,000 kilometres, well inside what most drivers would still call the easy, trouble-free years of ownership. On Allrow, the Australian Land Rover Owners Forum, an entire thread exists purely to gather affected owners for a potential class action, referencing a similar case already settled in the United States over the exact same component. Here is what makes a timing chain failure so much worse than it sounds on paper. A timing belt is something owners generally know needs replacing on a schedule. A timing chain is sold to buyers as a lifetime part, so nobody budgets for it and almost nobody inspects it, right up until the moment it finally slips or snaps. When that happens inside a 4-cylinder engine, the pistons and valves that are supposed to move in perfect timed coordination collide with each other instead. The usual outcome is a full engine replacement, and owners in these forum threads describe bills stretching into the tens of thousands of dollars on vehicles that most people would still consider to be in their prime. It's the kind of failure that can turn a $50,000 SUV into a vehicle with essentially no trade-in value overnight. And it's happening on an engine badge that specifically promised owners they would never have to think about it. The Ingenium diesel is also a different beast to the older TDV6 that Land Rover used in the bigger Discovery and Range Rover Sport. So if you're cross-shopping the family, don't assume the reputation of one automatically carries across to the other. Each engine code earns its own report card here. Badge loyalty doesn't buy you a free pass. Number 4. Toyota's own paperwork between roughly 2007 and 2014. The Hilux in its KUN26 body, alongside the Prado in its KDJ120 and KDJ150 generations, ran the 3-litre 1KD FD turbo diesel in its Euro 4 emissions form. In September 2014, Toyota issued an internal technical service bulletin, number EG08T0112. formally acknowledging that the pistons in these engines are prone to cracking, not might crack, under extreme conditions. Are prone to cracking, in Toyota's own words. And the bulletin states that the cracking is most common between 100,000 and 150,000 kilometres, sitting right inside the exact window this entire video is built around. Here is the mechanism behind it. To meet tighter Euro 4 emissions targets, Toyota redesigned the piston, dropping the compression ratio and removing a fibre-reinforced section inside the piston crown that had strengthened the earlier, pre-Euro 4 version of this same engine family. That reinforcement was quietly deleted from the new design, leaving the revised piston with a noticeably smaller margin before it fails under completely normal combustion pressure. When it finally lets go, the failure is sudden rather than gradual. A hard knock appears from nowhere. The engine drops onto what feels like 3 cylinders, black smoke pours from the exhaust, and crankcase pressure spikes almost immediately. This isn't a slow leak you catch early with a dipstick check. It's a bang, usually somewhere inconvenient and often somewhere remote. To be fair to Toyota, they did partially address this in later production, improving the injectors and strengthening the pistons from around July 2014 onward, and cracked pistons have shown up less often since. But here is the part that genuinely stings. This is the exact same manufacturer that built one of the toughest, most bulletproof diesel engines in automotive history. An engine we're going to get to before this video ends. Toyota knows precisely how to build something that survives 1 million kilometres without complaint. On this particular engine, in this particular era, they chased efficiency and emissions numbers over outright durability, and hundreds of thousands of Hilux and Prado owners inherited that trade-off without ever being told about it. Given how many Hilux and Prado utes were sold in this exact window, this isn't a rare, unlucky outlier sitting at the bottom of the list. It's one of the single most common early engine deaths on Australian roads, quietly hiding behind one of the most trusted badges in the country. Number 3. The Ford Ranger and its badge-engineered twin, the Mazda BT50, and an eager cooler that quietly floods the engine with coolant from the inside. The PX and PX2 generation Ranger, built from 2011 into the 2020s, became one of the best-selling four-wheel drives in this country, largely on the back of its 3.2-litre 5-cylinder Duratorque diesel. It's a strong, torquey engine, and most owners will happily tell you it tows beautifully. What a lot of those same owners find out later is that the eager cooler, which recycles a portion of exhaust gas back into the intake to cut emissions, is plumbed directly into the engine's cooling system. When that cooler cracks internally, coolant doesn't leak onto the ground where you'd notice it straight away. It leaks directly into the cylinders instead. Coolant doesn't compress the way an air and fuel mixture is supposed to. So when a cylinder fills with water on the intake stroke instead of air, something inside that engine has to give. And it's usually a connecting rod bending like a piece of wire under the pressure. Umter Engines, a workshop that rebuilds these units for a living, lists a blown head gasket, hold pistons, and bent connecting rods as the standard damage list once an eager cooler fails and goes unnoticed for even a short period. The other well-known killer on this exact engine comes from the injectors themselves. When one starts to leak, instead of atomizing fuel the way it should, it can dribble diesel directly onto the piston crown underneath it, creating a hot spot that eventually burns straight through the metal. Unsealed 4x4 magazine, which covers this platform closely, reports that workshops now recommend reconditioning or replacing the injectors at 100,000 kilometres purely as cheap insurance, because the alternative is a hole burned straight through a piston, and once again, a full rebuild. For an engine sitting underneath more Australian four-wheel drives than almost any other on the road today, that's an uncomfortable number of owners quietly rolling the dice every single day without knowing it. The frustrating part is that both failure paths, the eager cooler and the leaking injector, are cheap to check and comparatively cheap to fix if you catch them early. It's only the owners who don't know these two things exist that end up funding somebody else's engine rebuild business. Number 2, the Nissan Navara and Pathfinder, and a timing chain that Nissan itself made weaker than the one it replaced. The YD25 2.5 litre turbo diesel powered the D22 and D40 generation Navara, along with the R51 Pathfinder, through most of the 2000s and well into the 2010s. Earlier Nissan diesels used a duplex, double-row timing chain, a genuinely tough setup that rarely caused trouble for anyone. When the YD25 arrived, Nissan swapped the fuel pump drive chain over to a single row design instead, and that single row chain wears out far faster than most owners would ever expect from a modern turbo diesel. One D40 owner, only 8 years into ownership and with just 125,000 kilometres on the clock, described a rattling noise on cold start that got progressively worse over the following month, right up until the engine let go completely. When his mechanic finally opened it up, the timing chain had snapped and the crankshaft sprocket underneath was visibly worn down to almost nothing. He had serviced the vehicle strictly on schedule the entire time, using the recommended oil and filters. Andrews High Tech Automotive, a workshop that specialises in this exact engine, now recommends inspecting the timing chain at 100,000 kilometres. Then again, every 40,000 kilometres after that, specifically because the failure often gives almost no meaningful warning before it happens. And when a timing chain does let go on this engine, it's never a gentle stall. The pistons and valves are timed to move in perfect coordination, and the moment that coordination disappears mid-rotation, they collide inside the cylinder head. Best case scenario, that means a very expensive valve and piston repair. Worst case, it means a completely destroyed engine, and given how many tradies and grey nomads have relied on the YD25 to get them into some genuinely remote parts of this country, that's exactly the kind of failure nobody wants 6 hours from the nearest town. The bitter irony is that the Navara built its reputation on exactly that kind of remote area touring, which makes a silent, poorly warned timing chain issue about the worst possible flaw a mid-sized dual cab could have. Number 1. The Nissan hand grenade. Between roughly 2000 and the mid-2000s, the GU generation Nissan Patrol was available with a 3-litre non-common rail turbo diesel called the ZE30 DDTI. On paper, it looked like a natural successor to one of the most respected engines Nissan ever built, an engine we're about to spend some proper time on. In practice, this version of the ZE30 built a reputation for cracked cylinder heads and blown head gaskets that arrived far earlier than any owner had a right to expect from a Japanese-built diesel. Forum after forum tells basically the same story on repeat. An owner buys a low-kilometre, well-serviced Jew Patrol, often an ex-government or ex-fleet vehicle with an unusually clean history, and within the first 100,000 kilometres, sometimes well before that, the engine starts running hot for no obvious reason. A pressure test follows. The verdict, almost every single time, is a cracked head or a failed head gasket with a repair bill that can run into several $1,000s, sometimes enough on its own to write the vehicle off entirely. THAM Northern Beaches, a 4-wheel drive parts retailer that specialises in patrol repairs, puts it plainly, describing the early ZE30 as having developed a reputation for engine failures, particularly in its earlier years of production, a reputation that later common rail versions of the same engine family had to work hard to shake off. To Nissan's credit, the later common rail versions of the ZE30 that followed this early non-common rail engine are generally regarded as a genuine step up, with far fewer cracked head reports once the fuel system and cooling design were reworked. But that improvement came too late for the thousands of owners who bought a Patrol during exactly the years this reputation was earned. Here is what really stings about this one. Nissan didn't lack the engineering knowledge to build something genuinely bulletproof. They had already done exactly that with the engine this Patrol was supposed to replace. They just didn't repeat it. And that's the perfect place to pivot, because it's time to talk about the engine that made the Patrol legendary in the first place. If you're finding this useful, and you're the kind of person who actually checks a logbook before buying a second-hand four-wheel drive, hit subscribe, because this channel breaks down exactly this sort of Aussie car news and real-world ownership reality every week. Before we move on, it's worth noticing something about that list of 7. Almost none of them are exotic, low-volume engines. Number 3, the Nissan Patrol TD42. And the reason Nissan's overall reputation survived the ZE30 at all. Fitted to the GQ and early GU generation Patrol from the late 1980s through to 2007, the TD42 is a 4.2-litre, cast-iron, straight-six turbo diesel, and it earned a reputation among mechanics as what they still openly call a 500,000-kilometre engine. Where the ZE30 that eventually replaced it used a chain to drive the camshaft, the TD42 used a set of gears instead. A genuinely old-school, almost industrial approach that turned out to be nearly impossible to wear out under normal, everyday use. The real-world evidence here isn't just internet folklore either. Prime Mover magazine profiled one Queensland-based Patrol, used as a pilot vehicle for wide-load escorts and serviced without fail at the local Nissan dealership, that passed 1 million kilometres on its original TD42 and was still doing the exact job it had been bought for on the day it crossed that milestone. Cars Guide and other Australian motoring outlets that have profiled this engine over the years consistently describe it the same way. Simple, mechanical, close to indestructible, and genuinely missed by owners the moment Nissan finally discontinued it in 2007. It isn't a fast engine, and it never once pretended to be. But if you ever wanted concrete proof that Nissan absolutely knew how to build something that outlasts the vehicle wrapped around it, the TD42 is still sitting in driveways, farm sheds, and outback stations across this country, quietly doing exactly that, right now, decades after it left the factory. Plenty of serious touring enthusiasts still deliberately hunt down an older GQ Patrol running this engine over a newer model. Not because it's comfortable or quiet, but because they know exactly what they're getting under the bonnet, and they know it isn't going to leave them stranded in the middle of a remote track. Number 2, the Toyota 1HZ, and proof that Toyota already had the answer years before it went and built the problem. Introduced in 1990 for the 70 and 80 series Land Cruiser, the 1HZ is a 4.2-litre, naturally aspirated straight-six diesel, and it might genuinely be the most deliberately unambitious engine on this entire list, which is exactly why it works. No turbo, no intercooler, a fully mechanical fuel injection system with no electronic control unit involved at any point in the process. Toyota built it to survive heavy, sustained load, rather than to impress anyone with a power figure on a spec sheet. And the reputation it earned over the following decades reflects that decision perfectly. Cars Guide has described the 1HZ as capable of running for at least 500,000 kilometres before needing any major work, with some fleet operators and outback tour companies reporting a full 1 million kilometres on the original internals. It's the engine aid organisations specifically request when they're buying vehicles for some of the most remote, unforgiving parts of the planet. Because when something eventually does go wrong on the 1HZ, there's no computer to plug in and no dealer scan tool required. A bush mechanic with a basic toolkit and a torch can diagnose and fix it on the side of a dirt track. hundreds of kilometres from the nearest town. Toyota still builds this exact philosophy into the current 70 Series Land Cruiser today, which tells you almost everything you need to know. When Toyota wants an engine that simply refuses to quit, they know precisely how to build one. The 1KD FTV, sitting back at number 4 on our other list, wasn't a mistake born from ignorance. It was a trade-off Toyota made on purpose, chasing efficiency and emissions targets over outright durability in a different era for a different set of buyers. The 1HZ shows you exactly what happens when that same trade-off goes the other way instead. Ask any mechanic in a rural Australian town which second-hand diesel they would put their own family in without a second thought, and the 1HZ comes up more often than almost any other engine ever built. Number 1. The Isuzu D-Max and MUX, running the 4JJ1 and its successor the 4JJ3. And the reason tradies across this entire country keep buying the same platform generation after generation. This 3-litre, 4-cylinder common rail turbo diesel has powered the D-Max and MUX since 2008, and it's consistently described by reviewers and workshops alike as one of the most reliable diesel engines available in any new 4-wheel drive currently sold in Australia. When Isuzu updated the engine to the current 4JJ3 specification, Care Expert reported the manufacturer didn't chase a flashy twin-turbo setup the way some rival manufacturers did. They logged more than 4 million kilometres of real-world testing on the update instead, deliberately protecting the exact durability that made the outgoing 4JJ1 famous with tradies and tourers in the first place. Owner reviews on productreview.com all tell a remarkably consistent story. Diesel particulate filters still working cleanly past 300,000 kilometres. Drivetrains regularly described by owners as good for 500,000 kilometres or more, with completely standard servicing and no special treatment. And unlike some of the engines earlier on this list, these aren't rare. Lucky. 1 in 1,000 examples that happen to dodge a bullet. This is the normal, expected outcome for a D-Max or MUX that has simply been serviced on schedule. Nothing more heroic than that. That's really the whole difference between the engines that die early and the ones that just don't. It was never truly about diesel versus diesel, or turbo versus naturally aspirated. It comes down to which manufacturers treated 150,000 kilometres as the absolute bare minimum an engine should be able to handle, and which ones treated it as a nice to have. Isuzu isn't chasing headlines with this engine either. It's chasing exactly the reputation the D-Max already has, and every extra kilometre of testing they log is a kilometre spent protecting that reputation rather than gambling with it. If you're about to buy a used 4-wheel drive, do yourself a genuine favour and look up the exact engine code before you look at anything else on the listing, because that code matters more than the year, the trim level, or how clean the interior looks in the photos. Once you know the engine code, the pre-purchase checklist is actually pretty short. Pull the coolant reservoir cap and look for any hint of an oily film. Listen for a rattle on a genuinely cold start before the engine has run for even 30 seconds. Ask for the full service history, not just the last stamp in the book, and specifically ask whether the timing chain, the injectors, or the eager cooler have ever been touched, replaced, or even inspected. That's the full list. 7 engines quietly wrecking Aussie tourers and tradies before their time, and 3 that this country has trusted for decades and is still trusting today. If this saved you from buying the wrong ute, let me know in the comments which engine on this list surprised you the most, and I will see you in the next one.